Hi everybody, I'm Dillon. I'm the co-founder and growth lead at Princeton Biopartners. We're a strategy consulting firm focused in life sciences. We do a lot of work around AI, and I'm pleased today to host a podcast with Brian Caffo. Brian Caffo is a professor of biostatistics at Johns Hopkins University. He also sits on the board there. Today, we're hoping to gain some insight into AI's application and what it means for the pharmaceutical industry. Brian, do you want to just briefly introduce yourself, please?
Thank you for the nice introduction and offering to have me on the podcast. This is great. So hi, I'm Brian Caffo. I'm a professor in biostatistics and in biomedical engineering. As mentioned, I also sit on the board of directors for our new Data Science and AI Institute, which is a really exciting endeavor at Hopkins to bring in quite a few new faculty, over 100 in AI, and really level up our computing, including things like graphics processing units.
Obviously, we see AI having this permeating effect across the pharma enterprise. We work a lot with real-world evidence teams, and I think there is a ongoing thought and discussion around how and where AI interplays into the efforts that are going on for real-world evidence, particularly around data collection and synthesis. Just would love to get your take on what you view as the potential applications, upside, and limitations around the use of AI for real-world evidence.
I think purely AI-driven diagnoses, where AI is a product. So it wouldn't be a pharmaceutical product, but it would be a medical device product. So that exists to some extent in radiology. I think it exists to some extent in pathology. And we were talking about dermatology. Connor's a dermatologist, if I'm not mistaken. Dermatology, you can have sort of optical images of moles and things like that. But it's not doing complete diagnoses, but it's doing kind of a complete, taking from a particular data type or image and developing a recommendation or a summary, a more complete summary. And so in those cases aside, I think the kind of our vision of the sort of AI doctor, that's just currently that's as far away as it has ever seemed. Is that part where you have something listening in the background and it comes up with a complete diagnosis, and you really only need the human in the loop for liability purposes, and then after long enough you wouldn't need the human in the loop. That kind of mental model, that seems much less realistic than something like driverless cars, where it's a much simpler problem in a sense. Wherever people think that it's going to just completely take over intellectual work, it doesn't seem to do that well. The language models, what it writes is very anodyne. The way it summarizes literature is very rudimentary. And there may be some evidence to the contrary of this, but I still think that effective use of AI seems to be more the way that things are, at least now, and looking forward for the next couple of years, sort of like effectively integrating AI into your system seems to be the better thing than trying to replace things with AI.
Yeah.
There is some, small stuff where you can replace it with AI. Medically, not necessarily for the pharma companies, but for medicine, you can imagine a lot of the supporting aspects, the non-diagnostic aspects of medicine, like AI having a huge impact there on scheduling, on note taking, right? Doctors spend an enormous amount of time writing notes, right? So automated note completion. You can imagine for note taking, you can imagine, it listening to the patient interview and then automatically filling in the note. So this kind of support stuff where, there's still people checking it over, and there's still, but it's not the sort of sci-fi version of AI. It's more,
To circle back to the question about real world evidence, I know a lot of companies are looking to gather patient quality of life metrics when they release a drug. And I'm curious if you can imagine or know of any uses in that space for AI, especially in terms of data gathering at kind of a population level or individual patients.
Yeah, so that's a great example, because people quality of life is one of those things like nutrition, where people aren't great about answering statements about their own quality of life, but you can infer things about their quality of life from other aspects of their life. They may interact in certain ways. So, if a person is not going outside much. But, part of the reason is because they have a lot of mobility issues, right? That's a different answer for, how often you walk or how often you go outside than a person who has perfect mobility, but just isn't going outside because of a psychiatric disorder, or depression, or something like that. Mm-hmm. You can imagine these models spotting interactions of these things that if we ask questions, spotting interactions of the questions that we wouldn't necessarily notice. And then the other thing is that they could, possibly collect signals that we would not normally, or we haven't historically been collecting. So you can think of like wearable computing signals, things like accelerometers and things like that. And the sort of the data and the AI go hand in hand. If you can get like streaming big data, complex data, things like that, the hope is that AI will then help you make sense of it. Or use it, maybe even if it doesn't make sense of it, at least would help you use it. So I think in measuring quality of life, someplace where it's kind of hopeful that it could help a lot in that area.
And Brian, just to follow up to that, right? So real world evidence, thinking of phase 4 studies, for example, a question may arise is to examine the efficacy of a drug in a particular patient subgroup. Drugs been on market for a while, so you can do a retrospective analysis. How can AI assist there in terms of the data mining, collection in electronic medical records and analysis? Is there a play there, or do you still feel it's premature? I know you mentioned there are some kind of, you have some skepticism around its reasoning.
Yeah, so, in that case, I still, one of the things it's really very poor at is this kind of complex study logic would be an example, or causal thinking would be another example. When you execute a retrospective study from medical records or something like that, you really have to think very hard about how the data comes into existence, the biases that can impact from what I've seen from AI is that they would tend to present sort of what I would describe as a fairly rudimentary look at that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. They would say, do some regression, do some logistic regression on these specific things, but maybe they wouldn't think about certain kinds of biases and whatnot that would arise from that kind of study. It's also true that for a lot of things, complexity isn't the key missing ingredient. So like for this quality of life thing, the conjecture that I was making was that, there's maybe some interactions that we don't think about. You're collecting a lot of things. You need to figure out how to do them. For these kinds of real world evidence studies, these later phase studies, they have an idea of why the drug works. They have an idea of the interaction. And it's probably not the case that high dimensional complex interactions are the fundamental thing that you need to look for. Instead, what's probably more hard about real world evidence is actually executing on it, right? Yeah. Literally getting the studies, and hopefully AI could help with this. It's very hard to go from a medical record to a data table that you can analyze. That is a really hard problem, right? Yeah. Diagnoses can be coded in 20 different ways. So there's something that I can imagine it helping a lot with. So you can imagine like having a lot of experts say, okay, look, we need to figure out how to like diagnose specific, let's say, worsening of diabetes symptoms. Well, that can be coded like 500 different ways in an electronic medical record, right? So you could have like the electronic medical record experts, do that, and over lots of patients, train an AI to kind of look for it and maybe help try and figure that out going forward. And maybe if you did enough of them, it could figure out how to do it for novel things. So yeah, at any rate, I can see it helping a lot with study organization, study ideation, help working with the electronic medical records, summarizing patient data. You could also imagine it, for notes. You can imagine summarizing notes. I bet it's quite good at that, right? If it's very hard to pay someone to read through notes and say, oh yeah, this indication was present in this note. AI can do that. It never gets sleepy. It'll always give you the same answer if you turn the temperature right on the language model. This isn't the same kind of evidence that you're talking about, but in qualitative data analysis, it's going to be an absolute game changer.
Completely hear you there. It's quite the paradigm shift. Okay, so thinking about kind of medical knowledge and the accessibility of it, dissemination, and so forth, AI is clearly having a profound effect in how clinicians and patients access healthcare information. I mean, Connor, you could attest to this from the clinician side. Brian, what do you see as the biggest shift in the next couple of years? And how do you think that that's going to play into some of the safeguard concerns that you mentioned earlier in the conversation?
I imagine for a lot of what I would describe these kind of like more ticky-tack things, more of that is going to be interact with your AI rather than calling your doctor type thing. So a good example of that, I actually just had one of these just recently. So I had plantar fasciitis, and I tried Claude and ChatGPT and Gemini. Had some conversation with them, told them about my symptoms, and they were good. They're really good. They gave me a list of things to do. And then I verified that by going to YouTube, and I'm fortunate enough to be married to a doctor. So asking my doctor wife also these things as well. And I would say it worked out pretty well. So I think for these kind of, but that's not yeah, my foot hurt, but it's not like something I needed to go to the hospital for or something like that. But I imagine for a lot of these smaller things, I imagine people it'll become like what maybe WebMD was.
Mm-hmm.
There is a problem though, right? It tends to be very kind of overly positive, like weird behavior too, right? If if it says you have plantar fasciitis, and I were to just come back like I absolutely don't have plantar fasciitis, I just say something back at it. It tries very hard to be like a people pleaser, like no, probably you don't have plantar fasciitis. What was I thinking? Some of that seems to have been trained out, and in terms of safeguards, I have noticed. They'll put a preamble about medical knowledge. This is just for language models. I noticed Google Lens, they're hoping to prototype a mole screener for you.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right.
Google working on a basically AI algorithm for dermatology for a while now, even before the GPT craze. They were probably one of the first ones to get into that space. And dermatology, radiology, and pathology are visual specialties, so it makes sense that visual models should, have a place. I think that within the physician community, what is often talked about is the fact that there's been a lot of work on this in radiology, and it still hasn't made it to the point where it's really clinically replacing folks. And so I think there's a lot of regulatory hurdles to that. Now we're in a totally different environment than we were 20 years ago when some of this stuff started. And that regulatory easing might occur. But that's definitely something that we talk about. I want to give some perspective too. You mentioned, we think about patients using these AI models, and the secret is, physicians are using them too. The common problem in clinic is where I see this used is that you have a patient with a lot of different comorbidities. That means like a lot of different diseases. They're on a ton of different medications, and you need to start a new medication, but you want to make sure that that new medication doesn't interact with either the underlying comorbidity, there's not a contraindication there, or it doesn't interact, with one of their medications in a negative way. And it used to be that you would go to certain tools and people still do, like Lexicomp or UpToDate, and kind of brute force this by yourself and hope that you're being shown all of the contraindications or warnings. But when a patient comes in with 7 comorbidities, they're on 20 drugs, putting that all together in a fast clinic environment can be difficult. So I see a lot of physicians using tools like Open Evidence, Perplexity, even ChatGPT to just ask those questions. Here's my patient profile. This is the medication I want to start. What safety issues should I be concerned about? And I want to orient a question around that to maybe people in medical affairs or medical education who are listening to this. One real question is, where is AI pulling some of this data in terms of studies that might suggest a drug is superior in a certain indication? And if I'm a medical affairs person, or I'm a company that thinks my drug is best, how do I position myself in the literature that AI is pulling from to make sure that AI gets it right? Because I think that there's some opacity there to what AI is actually doing behind the scenes when it suggests these papers. But speaking to the clinician's perspective, we don't have a lot of ability to, in a fast-paced environment, triple check that the paper that it's showing me is, the most robust.
Right.
And it happens all the time.
I believe companies like Open Evidence and others I'm sure they train on, for example, PubMed data and the open literature. What ChatGPT and Gemini and Claude and all of those train on is sort of closely guarded secrets. Though, was it Google released an open model that had been trained only on like academic papers, which would have included medical papers. Some of the deep research capability can combat some of this, so that, if you click on deep research in GPT or deep research in Claude or Google, or I think Grok has something called deeper research, where I think you can do deep or deeper research. But what it boils down to is it goes on the internet in whatever its version of trusted sources are, grabs that data, puts it into the context window, because these context windows, by context window, we mean the number of the size of the number of characters that can go into the model as the predictor space for the next set of the words that it's going to put out. So the context window, it then recycles the content it's grabbing off the internet into the context window. That means it can actually, learn things that, or it can talk about things that are past the training date, because some of that information will have been brought in from the web search. But I don't think there's a lot of safeguards in the sense of what you're describing, where maybe the study that it's referencing isn't a particularly robust study, or to stop it from hallucinating. They've definitely gotten better at not hallucinating. Certainly when they do this kind of iterative process where they add information to the context window like that, they seem to hallucinate a lot less. The people using it need to be aware of its limitations. Right. So there was like a lawyer that was using GPT to generate case law, and it was just hallucinating case law.
Right.
It's not like that person had the wrong idea of using AI to help them like generate historical case law for a particular study. They were just using it incorrectly. They didn't, there was lots of ways they could have used it in order to streamline their process and still have it be accurate. So I think some of this is like maybe an education problem, where we need to teach people how to use this stuff effectively and safely, because the safeguards, I'm not sure if the safeguards are ever going to keep up with the pace of technological development.
Yeah. Great point.
I have actually a question. It's a little bit of a sci-fi question for Brian, but there's this concept of like a technological singularity, which is this idea that as technology becomes sufficiently advanced, basically no human on the planet will know how it functions under the hood. And I kind of feel like I experienced that basically with all technology I interact with, like even just deciding what setting to put my dryer on. I don't know any way of like understanding how most stuff around me works, but this concept is that eventually even humanity's best engineer is going to have no clue. And it's usually tied in with the concept of AI generally. I'm curious if you could just give us an overview of when we use the term AI, what's kind of under the hood? What are the processes or models that most people are thinking of when they use that term? And I think there's probably a difference between laymen using that term and professionals like yourself. I'm assuming that there's different competing AI models and all these things, but maybe a shared underpinning to the process that most people are referring to.
The first part of your question discussed what people typically refer to as X risk. And X risk comes in different sort of categories, and almost all of it centers around the idea of intelligence. I think sometimes it's framed in the form of what's called superintelligence. And so one variation of X risk is the consequences of having entity that has at some level more intelligence than the entirety of humanity combined from all time and all future time. And what are the consequences of that thing? Usually, it delves into questions of consciousness and sentience and self-supportability of the AI entity, and these kind of heady topics. Then there's concern over whether or not the entity then pursues some kind of self-preservation in a way that we are aware of or not even aware of. Some people talk about this in terms of collective intelligences that, like maybe that a beehive has a higher collective intelligence than a bee or something like that. Then there's another variation of this, which would be that it has nothing to do with intelligence, but optimization. That the paperclip example is often cited as an example of this, where you try to optimize AI to pursue making paperclips, and in the process of making paperclips, it starts to use up all natural resources, turns humans into batteries, all in the service of, in that sense, the AI is sort of like a virus, an out of control virus. It's not intelligence that's the problem. It's optimization that's the problem. It's trying to optimize for a goal that's different than, and it can't understand, then it's different than what humanity wants. I'm not a huge X-risk person. I would guess I would assume for the audience, there's a couple of really nice resources on it. I believe the author's name is Nick Bostrom, the philosopher, and there's a book called Superintelligence. So if you want a treatment on this that kind of predated AI hype, there's a good place to start. Because it's fun to talk about. There's a ton of podcasts and writers about this content. For me, it's a little less interesting because I think if you take away the emotional valence of the word intelligence, then a lot of those arguments sort of fall apart, right? And anyway, that goes to your second question, because these are data models. And the most kind of common version of AI that people associate with the term is generally referred to as so-called neural networks or artificial neural networks. And these date back to, I think it was McCulloch and Pitts. So they started with the artificial models of the neuron, and then it built upward from there toward models that tried to model in silico. They tried to model physical brains. Eventually, the neural networks have kind of been shedding their biological origins and heading more towards performance type things. So, modern neural networks, their architecture, the word architecture refers to how you design the neural network. Their architectures don't have a lot of analogy back to biology. But the origin was on trying to duplicate biological systems in sort of with a sort of machine learning technique. There's quite a bit of overlap. I would say the two terms overlap quite a bit of what we call machine learning and what we call artificial intelligence. I think there's maybe some negligible differences between the two. Maybe you would argue that artificial intelligence, tries to mimic things that we would classify as tasks of intelligence, like vision recognition or language or something like that, whereas machine learning could be for anything. Anyway, once you then include the class of machine learning algorithms and pretend like those are artificial intelligence too, then it brings in a bunch of other techniques that people use that aren't necessarily neural networks. So people use support vector machines and random forest and gradient boosting. And so, but all of these boil down to nonlinear data models.
Brian, you brought up a really good point around kind of this optimization challenge and the paperclip example you used there. What kind of safeguards are being put in place? And is there any kind of regulatory standard that's being adhered to or developed as of now?
So the concern over this, I think right now, I guess, would largely exist in so-called language models, these, chatbots and things like that, with maybe the concern being, they could say inappropriate things, manipulate people. There was a very tragic case of a 14-year-old who committed suicide after having a conversation with a chatbot that was designed to be a sort of companion. So in terms of regulation, there is existing regulation that is unrelated to AI about, corporate accountability for products they put out. But then in terms of broader AI and regulation, I think it's fair to say that, the federal regulatory entities and state regulatory entities are having a hard time keeping up with the pace of technological development. So this goes from places like schools where how do we figure out what to do with teaching and students and them using these tools for their homework and for classrooms, all the way to how people interact with them. There's an increasing effort to create sort of AI companions. What does that mean as people start to form relationships with AI that feel like real relationships? There's been some weird high-profile examples of this, but you can imagine this becoming much larger of a problem. So we actually run a bit of a program at Hopkins on trying to educate congressional staffers on AI so that they can produce legislation or white papers or executive orders or whatever. But we don't take any particular stance on it. We just try to simply educate people about AI so they can make informed decisions. AI and warfare would be another example of what are we doing there? And it's not just AI robots, right? It's AI and the logistics, AI and all the aspects of warfare that underlie modern warfare, just in the same way that in the same way that they underlie a company or something like that. There was the Biden white paper. There was the executive order on AI. That was an interesting start. It had some ethical guidelines. But I think it's fair to say that the current administration has a more let the enterprises experiment more type attitude towards AI regulation. And then among the companies, you can see, you have some that are very locked down. They do all this sort of secondary training of the AI to try and prevent it from saying inappropriate things and things like that. So you have companies that are very locked down. You could argue Google's like that. And then you have companies that are very open with their AI. Probably the most notable example right now is XAI. The Grok is the name of their product. That's the Elon Musk thing. So having much looser controls over content moderation, and some of them do moderation, like they do some secondary checks outside of the AI, but then some of them, many of them will have this sort of secondary step where they fine tune the AI, to prevent it from making racist statements is an example.
We get into our kind of more pharma-oriented discussion, although I think this gels with that. What's sometimes a hard concept for me to understand in the fears around AI is this jump from having to prompt a model to the model creating inferences and plans and actions on its own. And I think this relates to research too. Right now, how I see GPT, for example, used, or Perplexity used in the clinic is I have a question, I come to you with the question, you then pull data from me. But what I would ideally like to see from a super powerful AI would be the AI comes to me with a research idea or a new inference about medicine, sort of independent of what I'm capable of thinking about. And so I feel like in some ways, these AI models are limited by the creative or the prompter in a way. I even saw there was a school that's developing a minor in AI prompting to get at this exact question, which is that we are, it seems, as much a part of asking intelligent questions to the system as the system is in returning intelligent answers. Is there a world you imagine where the system might operate independently, where, let's say, hypothetically, an AI were to just come to a pharma company with, a drug idea? Or is it always going to be a question of, based on how these processes work under the hood, a human kind of interacting first with that model?
Yeah, so I mean, at some level, what you're describing is, can it guess what our goals are, as provided the AI is working in service of us? Amazon had a program at one point where you didn't order stuff from Amazon; it guessed at what you wanted and sent you stuff. You just sent back what you didn't want. There's been attempts of that, and it's basically like asking, can the AI guess our wants? So you can imagine in a clinic, an AI has audio and sensors and visual sensors and whatnot, and it's watching you perform an exam, and it notices a mistake and makes a recommendation about that, or also makes some suggestion about diagnoses or something like that. Does it just based on observation without any prompting. But at some level, someone would have to kind of program that behavior into the AI to make sure that it knew that kind of guessing was the goal in and of itself. But you could imagine an AI that's reading your email and says, "Hey, this person emailed you. How about this as a response?" Where it's the whole email, including putting stuff on your calendar and what you do, I think that's the goal. I think it'll actually get pretty good at some tasks like that. And then there's the idea of creativity. It's interesting you brought that up, because I think Jeff Hinton, so Jeff Hinton is, one of the patriarchs of AI, did a lot of the modern development of it and won a Nobel Prize, I believe, in physics, and the Turing Award, which is the CS, the Computer Science Nobel Prize. Anyway, Geoff Hinton recently gave comments about creativity in AI and saying that no, they really can have a lot of creativity, and it's basically because when they generative AI, actually there's some randomness. It's sort of like it's guessing, it's randomly generating based on observation. So if it has an observation here and an observation there, and just for the people who aren't watching and listening, I have 2 points of my finger that I'm holding up. So there's 2 observations, but it might randomly generate something in between them. So not data that it's ever seen, just an inference based on the 2-point extrapolation based on the data that it has seen. And it does that all the time. So it can get better and better at extrapolating. You could argue is very similar to how we execute creativity. We don't come up with ideas whole cloth out of the blue with no background information. We usually build and interpolate between knowledge that we actually already have.
I agree. I think even in our personal neural network, there's the Purkinje cells that are a negative regulator of essentially reward behavior in a simple sense with movement. And it teaches us how to move in a normal way. So I could understand that those. Interestingly, you mentioned that it's based on an actual neural model. I could see how the same concepts could apply.
Yeah, and there certainly actually are attempts to like really model, like build in Purkinje cells and glial cells, and those have a tendency to be more neuroscience-y. But I totally agree with you that someone may build a process that mimics what that biological process is doing, even though it's untethered from the architecture of the biological process.
So Brian, we've seen AI play a role in patient recruitment and adaptive designs, even biomarker classification. For example, ICON reported AI-assisted identification of clinical trial sites, and it helped basically double the monthly enrollment rate in a rescue study. From your perspective, where is AI already making a tangible difference in clinical trials, and where is it still kind of in need of more? Where is there more promise than practice?
What I see is AI is having its biggest impact in what I would just call as support roles. So in study planning, in coding, in anything that can also just be mapped onto an activity that is similar to what a non-clinical trial organization would work on. Non-clinical trial analysis organizations also have to do coding. They also have to organize studies. They also have their mechanics of how they're running their organization. All of that stuff, just like everywhere else, if you're not using AI, you're falling behind. What I've seen from AI-related pharmaceutical conferences, one of the main areas I've noticed people making good headway is this sort of trial planning type activities, or after a trial has occurred, you kind of helping with advertising or marketing efforts, these sort of things like research synthesis and ideation and idea generation, and then there's the things that depending on what you want to call AI, that get used a lot for things like observational data analysis and real world evidence studies. So things that are probably closer to machine learning, those get used a lot. Pharmaceutical companies are always, very avant-garde in their thinking. So, I imagine they're integrating it into all aspects of their institutions. I doubt they're doing sort of what I would describe as full-on vibe analysis. So you could, how there's vibe coding for people who do software development. So the idea of vibe coding is you literally just put in a prompt and then accept what the AI is generating. You iterate and stuff like that, but you can generate software that way. And in fact, the software that you can generate is getting better and better. Well, you can do the same thing with analysis. You can sort of vibe analysis. But I think just because of the regulatory aspect of the pharmaceutical industry, I doubt that there's any vibe analysis. I bet it's still quite locked down because they have to protect patients. So the eventual people who are going to take the drugs. So I think they probably have that still fairly locked down. But you can imagine AI is used in the process, maybe helps generate code, maybe helps perform analyses, but it's not like I bet they're very far away from any kind of vibe stuff.
And we call it vibe now because there's this sense of looseness to it. But do you imagine as the AI models become more robust, that vibe turns into actually this is the standard. This is better
Oh
than.
yeah, absolutely. I think it boils down to language becoming the interface. So language is the interface to the analysis engine rather than code. And I actually think probably eventually it'll skip the intermediate step. So right now it's basically language code analysis. I have a feeling eventually it'll just go language analysis.
Okay.
It may skip the code entirely, but I don't know. That's conjecture. But yeah, certainly on the spectrum, I think when you describe vibe coding, you're skipping the step of checking the code.
Right.
And I doubt anyone in the pharmaceutical, at any stage of pharma analysis is that going on. However, using AI to generate code or using AI code completion has to be happening for sure. Yeah, I mean they're big smart companies. They do that for sure.
Brian, looking to the next 12 to 24 months, what's one AI trend in medicine that you think that pharma executives can't afford to ignore?
I would imagine, just back to the other question, fine-tuning models to your specific domain seems like you probably, and I have a feeling these big models are going to make it, so you want a model that's trained specifically on the autism literature. I have a feeling that's going to be one click fine tuning in the future. So I would look out for that, because this kind of goes back to the last question of like, well, how do you know what data it's training on? Well, I have a feeling soon you'll be able to fine tune models very quickly. This is maybe a negative thing to say, but I think pharmaceutical companies should probably not do too much of their own foundation model training. I think foundation model training has gotten to the point where, unless you're willing to devote, let's say $100 million to to training a foundation model, you're so much better off building off something that someone else already built. Mm-hmm. So you do get a lot of places thinking, buying GPUs and thinking they're going to train models, and it's probably not. 99% of the cases, you're probably better off like fine tuning a model that someone else has devoted that kind of energy to. Literal energy like electricity, but in addition to person time dedicated to building one of these models. So yeah, I think if you're in your boardroom and you're thinking about training a foundation model, I would definitely do a quick cost estimate of how much it would be versus what you might tend to get out of it. But certainly I would say AI related support systems would be one, regardless of what your kind of domain, whether it's supporting analysis or supporting literature generation. But from what I've seen, they're pretty on top of that stuff. And certainly right now everyone's very interested in agentic AI. Mm-hmm. And so certainly, kind of AI trained for for specific tasks that are a little bit more autonomous. These kinds of agent-based models would be a good thing to keep up with as well.
Very interesting, Brian. And just kind of feeding off of that, what do you feel is the most hyped AI promise right now?
Oh, in medicine, I think it's this sort of soup to nuts automated diagnoses. That kind of whole cloth diagnoses in medicine. That seems to feel further away, even though we're making more progress. But that doesn't mean it wouldn't have this huge impact on diagnoses and maybe we need fewer doctors. Like I think the sort of total replacement of the worker version of AI probably for most jobs is incorrect. But the idea that maybe we need fewer people doing the job because the ones that are working can be a lot more efficient, that seems very realistic. So maybe some of these AI tools will make one doctor very super powered, to make fewer errors, catch subtler diagnoses, make them more efficient. Probably, and I bet the efficiency gains are probably going to be more than the others, is my guess, right? Like if we can just cut down the amount of time that doctors have to spend not doctoring, that by itself would be a huge benefit, right? I forget what the number is, but it's an exorbitant amount of time that doctors spend not doctoring, like just entering notes and dealing with like insurance and
What do you feel like is the most underused AI opportunity, or one that's being overlooked right now?
It's hard because it's all it's all quite hyped up, so it's all getting looked at pretty closely. But I would certainly say people are sleeping a little bit on kind of classical machine learning. I still think that has a big space. I think certainly validation doesn't seem to get the attention that it deserves. In other words, we're going to need, as we put all these AI systems in place, we're going to need to validate them. We're going to need to run clinical trials where they're systems. And so I think that the so much of the subject is geared toward utilizing the AI and maybe not enough on validating the AI. I mean, there's quite a bit of people talking about explainable AI, which would be part of validation, but certainly explainable AI and this sort of meta AI studies are also things I think worth considering as well. So impact, when I say meta AI studies, sort of impact of the use of AI, just as an example, you could certainly study AI as an educational treatment, right? You have students, you're giving them certain prompts or something like that, and then they have an AI tutor. So is the student plus AI tutor plus the regular classroom different? Do they have better outcomes than it? At any rate, people need to evaluate these systems, not just like let them fall. However, try them out and wait for lore to tell us what to use.
Brilliant. We're over time. Thanks so much, both.
Okay, thanks. Well, I look forward to saying I was on number 1 when you guys get to 100 episodes.
That's right.
Love it.